Hello, my name's Kelly Reeve. I'm a researcher here with Understanding Society, and I'm going to talk to you today a bit more about our new survey we're adding to our portfolio, which focuses on couples who are living apart together. So I'm going to explain a bit more about why this particular topic is important, what we know already from existing research, and what we'd still like to find out, and why that's important for researchers and for policymakers. So first of all, why is it important to look at couples living apart together? So traditionally, a lot of the official surveys, and Understanding Society included, focused on the household as the concept of the family. So only those who lived under the same roof were considered to be a family in that sense. But of course, many people have connections with others across different households. And so if we take an example here we've got an adult living seemingly on their own in a household. So they, for official survey purposes, would be considered a single person. Similarly here, we've got an adult living with a dependent child, and in official surveys, they may be considered to be a lone parent. But consider actually whether this adult is in a relationship with somebody living somewhere else, then they're actually a couple living apart together. And in the second scenario, consider there's another parent who's also living elsewhere. Here now, they're parents living apart. And it's very important to capture all of this, because if we're only asking about people who live in the household, we're missing a whole other dimension to people's lives. So that may be a relationship, children, or sources of emotional, practical, and financial support. And existing research has shown, research by Nat Sen, University of Birkbeck and Bradford, that over 1/5 of those who are officially classed as single are actually in a living apart together relationship. So who are couples living apart together? So about 10% of adults in Britain are in a relationship with someone who's living in another household. And this can be for a variety of different reasons. So there's a very diverse group. Some may be living apart together because they're in the early stages of their relationship, and they're not yet ready to or able to live together yet. It can also be circumstantial. So some people may have dependent children or caring responsibilities to others, which make it sort of impractical for them to also be living with their partner. It can also be situational. So it could be that both partners are working a great distance apart or studying somewhere, and so it's just not practical for them to be living in the same place. And for some people, it's a choice. It's a conscious choice to live apart rather than to get married or to cohabit. And there's increasing evidence in the international literature that this is a choice that older people aged over 45 are choosing. So what do we know about couples living apart together in the UK? So we know that it spans the life course. It's not just young adults who are not yet ready to live together. So even though they are predominantly the biggest group, these nested young adults who may still live with their parents, are under 30, without any dependent children, they tend to be employed or full-time education and intend to live together in the future. That is probably by far the biggest group, but it's not the only group. So this research by Coulton, who also identified a situation where independent adults are living by themselves in a household. They tend to be over 30, not living with parents, in employment, and they may be divorced, separated, or never married. And they also intend to live with their partner in the future. A third group identified by this research were single parents. So that's adults with a dependent child in the household. They tended to mainly be female, employed, and caring for someone within the household. And this here, for this group, it was a 50-50 choice about split, whether it was a choice to live apart or whether it's, as I discussed before, more sort of circumstantial. And then there's this fourth group. So these are the older individuals over 50 who may be divorced or widowed. And they tended to care for someone who was outside the household. They tend to be in longer term living apart relationships, so they span more than 3 years, and they don't tend to be in employment. There are also other dimensions to this. So There's also something to do with the cultural or social acceptance of being in a living apart together relationship. This research showed that there was evidence that British-born ethnic minorities were more likely to be living apart together as opposed to just cohabiting when compared with white British. And those who lived in urban areas were more likely to be living apart together than being married or cohabiting compared to those who lived in rural areas. So what else do we know about couples living apart together? We also know that it's not necessarily a linear thing. So there's a lot of perceptions that it is people who live apart together to start with, and then decide to move in together and then decide to perhaps get married. Of course, that does form part of it, but it's not the whole story. It may be that people just choose long-term, like I said, especially with this older group, to live apart together as a long-term arrangement. Similarly, someone may start to live together and then after a trial period decide that they want to continue living apart. And that can be, like I said before, for a number of different reasons. It could be for work or study or to maintain the relationship. Similarly, after being married, you also get couples who may live apart. And this may be part of a decoupling process. It may be a temporary arrangement if they're experiencing marital problems. And it may eventually lead to separation. And then we find as well that after separation, if an individual then goes on to have another relationship, there is some evidence to suggest that this new relationship, they will continue to live apart together rather than go through the traditional steps of cohabitation and marriage. So the survey, the research I mentioned before by Nat Sen, University of Birkbeck and Bradford, found that actually 1/5 of couples had actually previously lived together. So it's definitely not just the stepping stones to marriage. It's can happen at any point across this. So what are we trying to find out in our survey? So to build on what we already know, our survey will be inviting both halves of a couple to give us an insight into their relationships. So what we want to know is who's in these relationships, how old are they, what's their gender, ethnicity, health, education, nationality, employment, who do they live with? So that could be children, care and responsibilities. How do they live apart? So how often do they see each other? Do they have friends in common? Do they share any resources? And has the pandemic in particular affected their relationship? And then we want to know why are they living apart? So is it a choice? Is it because of work, finances, caring, commitments, any other reason? And then we want to know what future plans might be. So would they like to live together and marry in future? Would they like to continue living apart? So why is it important to capture this sort of information? So particularly recently with the COVID pandemic, couples who live apart were largely overlooked by the policies. So between March and June 2020, they were prohibited from seeing each other. And it was only in June that these linked households were recognised. But that was only really possible for individuals who didn't live with other adults. And then in September 2020, the guidance changed to allow those who were in established relationships to see each other. So what this really highlighted is that couples who live apart together are actually largely invisible to policymakers. And it's only really by understanding who's in these relationships and why and how it's actually practiced that we can try to look at whether it masks particular vulnerabilities or inequalities. So we very much hope that by conducting this survey and giving an insight into these relationships, we can promote research in this area that makes living apart together couples more visible. And hopefully increase recognition and provision of support. There are also a number of policy implications for couples living apart together. So for example, if it's a conscious choice not to live together, then of course there's a more demand on housing. Rather than living together in one household, you've got individuals in a household each. There's also implications for the provision of care because Traditionally, at least, adults that live together or people that live together tend to provide informal care to others living in the household. But if there's a relationship where people are living in separate households, then it might lead to the person in need of care relying on state support. There's also a financial dimension to this. So once people move in together, their finances for many things are considered jointly, and that may well be a reason in itself which deters people from moving in together. But it could also mean that there is a sharing of resources between households, but that's officially hidden. It's not seen or recognised at the moment. And lastly, when there's children involved, it may well be that this child has regular contact and the influence of a very important figure. But if we don't capture that, then we're missing out a very sort of important aspect of that child's development, their health, their well-being and their attainment. So it's important to capture the whole sort of family unit there. So in terms of taking part, it's by invite only. So if you've got an invitation, follow the steps that you've received in your email or letter. The survey is online and it will take 15 to 20 minutes to complete, and we will send you a £5 thank you gift card on completion of the survey. If you do have any questions, there is a contact email address which is in all the materials that would have been sent out to you. Thank you very much.